Who's actually going to get the most out of a pre-built gaming rig like the Skytech Crystal, and who should just keep scrolling? Is it worth the price for the everyday gamer who plays just enough to stay social, or does it only make sense for the hardcore crowd chasing 144 frames per second on every title? Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon, and I'm going to walk through the real-world picture before you decide. When a pre-built PC lands on your radar, the first hesitation is usually, will it actually run the games I care about without me having to tinker? I've spent a few weeks pulling the Skytech Crystal out of its box, setting it up in a modest 3-monitor workstation, and running the same mix of titles that most of us juggle, from fast-paced shooters to sprawling RPGs. The question that kept popping up for me was whether the headline specs translate into a smooth everyday experience, or if there are hidden compromises that only show up after the warranty period. Let's start with who should consider this machine. If you're a gamer who wants to dive into the latest releases at 1080p or 1440p with high settings, and you don't want to spend weekends researching BIOS settings or hunting for the perfect aftermarket cooler, the Skytech Crystal hits a sweet spot. The Intel Core Ultra 5 processor, with its 4.2 GHz base and 5.2 GHz turbo, pairs nicely with the RTX 5060. In my tests, Fortnite and Apex Legends comfortably sat in the 120 to 140 frames per second range on a 144 Hz panel, while Cyberpunk 2077 at medium-high settings stayed around 55 frames per second at 1440p. That's more than enough for a fluid experience without having to dial everything down to low. If you're a creator who also needs a solid workstation, the 32GB of DDR5 RAM and a 1TB Gen4 NVMe SSD give you a lot of breathing room. I ran Photoshop, Premiere, and a couple of virtual machines simultaneously, and the system never hit a noticeable bottleneck. The 650W gold-rated PSU is generous enough that you could upgrade the GPU later without worrying about a power crunch, which is a practical upside for anyone who likes to future-proof a little. Now, who should skip this rig? First, anyone who lives in a tight space and needs a silent, ultra-compact build. The Crystal's case is a mid-tower with a high-performance air cooler that does a decent job, but under load you'll hear a consistent fan whine that can become audible if you're gaming late at night in a small room. If you value whisper-quiet operation above all else, you might look at water-cooled options or smaller form-factor PCs. Second, if you're an ultra-high refresh rate enthusiast chasing 240 Hz at 4K, the RTX 5060 will start to feel limited. It's a solid mid-range card, but you'll quickly hit its ceiling on the most demanding titles, and you'll need to drop settings or resolution to maintain those extreme frame rates. A practical strength that stands out is the built-in Wi-Fi 6. In my apartment, the wireless connection stayed rock solid even when streaming a 4K video on one screen while gaming on another. That eliminates the need for a separate Ethernet cable or a dongle, which is a nice convenience for people who don't want a cluttered desk. The inclusion of Windows 11 right out of the box also means you're not dealing with leftover bloatware or a forced upgrade path. The system boots clean, and you can start installing your game library immediately. On the flip side, the air cooling solution, while labeled high performance, isn't a silent champion. During extended play sessions, the cooler ramps up to keep the CPU under control, and you'll notice a modest increase in noise. It's not obnoxious, but if you're used to the near-silent hum of a liquid-cooled build, this will feel louder. Additionally, the case's cable management options are decent but not generous. I had to spend a few extra minutes tidying up the power and data cables behind the motherboard tray to keep airflow optimal. It's a small inconvenience, but for a pre-built that markets itself as plug-and-play, it's worth mentioning. Another hidden trade-off is the upgrade path. The motherboard is a standard ATX, so you can add a second SSD or more RAM, but the BIOS is locked to the OEM's firmware version. While it's stable for the current configuration, you'll need to check Skytech's support site for any BIOS updates before swapping out major components, especially if you plan to push the CPU beyond its stock settings. For most users, this isn't a deal-breaker, but for the tinkerer who likes to overclock, it adds an extra step. Value for money is where the Crystal really tries to stand out. At its price point, you're essentially paying for a re-editoplay system that spares you the headache of compatibility checks. Compare it to buying each component separately. You'd need to factor in the cost of a case, power supply, cooling solution, and the time spent researching. The Skytech bundle packages all those pieces into a single price that, based on the average market, lands you a few $100s lower than a